you know, as a teacher, you try and tie in individuals, you try and tie in events, you try and teach people, yo, we're looking at decision making, and it's other things too. So my frustration is I teach a unit, the unit's over, and I'm like, feel like you're ready now to learn about that unit. Like now you have the context, so now I can go in and we can start really looking at individual events and individual people and allow you to make judgments on them. And that's the fun part. Because while history is political and military events, and I'm a military historian by training, definitely not putting that down, but history is all the sort of human things, right? It's decision making. It's wars have been fought over people feeling like they've been dissed in a love relationship, right? I mean,
Battle of Troy.
There are cases after cases after cases. So you have, you have a case where King Richard. Which one?
Which one?
Name originality.
King Richard of the War of the Roses. Richard III. King Richard III actually suggested he was having an inappropriate relationship with his niece in order to possibly shame her and keep her from marrying someone who was a contender for the throne, who happened to be Henry Tudor, and that if he could suggest that he had been inappropriate with her, she would be unacceptable to Henry Tudor, and that the followers of her mother's followers and some of the followers of her father may continue to support him because that marriage wasn't going to happen. Right? I mean, I know this one's getting complicated, but we can sit down and talk about it, and you look at these individuals, and history, it's a fixed thing because it happened, but when you go back to the time when they're making it, it's not fixed. There are options and things and other directions it could go. And it went this way sometimes for highbrow, thoughtful reasons. Like, we should establish the concept of rule of law. One of the most amazing things about our country is the concept of rule of law. The concept of rule of law. So they've made decisions and writings, and they've gone through this stuff, and they've examined things, and they go, okay, we're going to do this in order to enforce rule of law. And that's amazing. Other times, decisions of far-reaching consequences are made for very human and ridiculous reasons. Andrew Jackson dismissed all but one person from his cabinet because their wives were being nasty to the wife of his favorite. The Petticoat Affair.
Isn't that illegal?
It's Andrew Jackson, like,
Yeah.
Well, look, what happened?
It also wasn't illegal at that point.
The vague sort of, very briefly what happened was you had this individual, and she was married to a Navy officer who was very popular in D.C. And this Navy officer, being a Navy officer, was gone frequently. And being D.C., they did what a lot of people with a little bit of wealth did in D.C., and they rented out their house to congressmen and senators. Well, they rented out their house to Benjamin Stoddard, who was a senator who was widowed recently. And so rumors began to spread that Senator Stoddard and our woman that we were mentioning earlier were becoming close. And by close, I mean physically. And so what eventually happens is her husband goes out to sea and he hangs himself. He hung himself. You are correct. Is it hangs?
It's hangs.
Let's not debate grammar because we're not going to win.
All right, anyways.
Maybe shouldn't, I don't even know.
Hung and hang have slightly different rules when it's a human. Anyways, he commits suicide. So the people in D.C. blame her. And then within a year, she's married, or at a year, she's married to Benjamin Stoddard. Benjamin Stoddard, some years later, is named Secretary of the Navy. And he sits on the cabinet that sits with the president and makes the decisions. Well, the other cabinet members' wives don't like her. Mrs. Stoddard is, she calls her husband, who was a wonderful man, to commit suicide. So what happened was, when Benjamin Stoddard was placed on the cabinet, she made her round of social visits to each of the other wives. And they received her either cordially or they weren't at home. And she left the card. Now, what you were supposed to do in those days is someone visited you. What is the social more? Anybody know? If someone called on you,
For tea.
you were supposed to call on them. You were supposed to go make arrangements to visit them. Not a single wife of the cabinet would go visit her.
How rude.
And so there was an event, and she was seated by President Jackson, and President Jackson was a widower at this time, and his wife had been mistreated because, she was married to two men at the same time. But that's another story for another time. And so what ends up happening is she was ostracized, and Jackson therefore has a soft spot. And when Mrs. Stoddard says, these other women are disrespecting me, they're dissing me, Jackson became angry. And so he doesn't say anything, and then at the next cabinet meeting, calls it to order, and he tells every one of his cabinet members, except for Stoddard and the vice president, because the vice president's wife had died. It would be interesting if she could recall a visit. And says, you go home and tell your wives to go visit Mrs. Stoddard, or you're no longer welcome on my cabinet. So every cabinet member, every single one said, my wife, I'll tell my wife to go be nice, make nice. And every single cabinet member went home, and the wives got together and said, we're not. We're not. So at the next cabinet meeting, Jackson has sent a note to Mrs. Stoddard. Have you been visited? No. So Jackson comes into the meeting and says to the entire cabinet except the Stoddard and the unmarried, the widower, you're no longer on the U.S. cabinet.
Andrew Jackson.
He fired,
Does this include the kitchen cabinet? Okay.
He fires them. He fires them all. And he replaces them and so on and so forth. But American policy changes.
Very drastic.
Yeah. For a very human reason. But how many of you have heard of the Petticoat Affair before?
This is first time.
Yeah. So the deal is, where I struggle is how do you teach history that way, but still have the context to understand what is the implication of that, how is that important, how did that change things. So that's the struggle. Now, we teach history in Montgomery County, at least U.S. history, and AP U.S. history for that matter. AP U.S. is pretty much straight chronologically. U.S. history is taught slightly themed, but there's only two themes. We teach domestic and we teach international.
What about Army?
And that's how it's taught. So